Steve has been an absolute, a wonder for GIS in New York City ever since his Nyberg days, and we're talking, what, 25, 30 years ago? So this man's got a GIS brain. He's been in leadership of Gizmo in the past. He's made presentation. He's almost a celebrity on at least, WNYC, New York One. So
also seen in New York.
Steve, you can do the rest, and thanks for coming and speaking to us.
I think probably my first meeting here was, I don't know, 1991. Anyway, yeah, so I've been using GIS for quite some time and active in Gizmo all those years. And so this is an election year. It's a big presidential election year, as well as various other races, state Senate and Assembly, and congressional races. And so the idea was to do several presentations on mapping election data. What does that mean? What are some of the issues involved? And we've done quite a bit of that. I work now at the City University of New York Graduate Center. We have a team there that's part of the Center for Urban Research. And through John Nolenkoff's work, who directs the center over many years, and our work in general, we do a lot of analysis of census data and immigration data and changing neighborhood characteristics and neighborhood patterns, not just mapping, but other types of analysis. And voting data is really interesting for a number of reasons. It's very local. The data is provided either by individual, if you're registered to vote, there's information about you and where you live, and also by election district, which are pretty small geographic areas. I'll talk more about that. And so it's a really interesting way of examining how the population is changing, what the population at a very local level is interested in, and also who has electoral power and how that's shifting and changing over the years. So we're really interested in voting data and have been for many years. In 2013, what I'm going to talk mainly about is our work to create an online election atlas for New York City, initially focused on the 2013 municipal races, especially the mayoral race, and how that's evolved since then. And if we have time, I'll talk about some of the more recent maps we've done, including for the presidential primary that was held in April in New York and some others. But I'll talk mainly about the work that we did to develop the atlas, what that means for mapping election data, what type of election data is out there, and we'll show some maps of that information. So in 2013, as you remember, was a big election year in New York City. The first time in like a dozen years that Mayor Bloomberg was not running anymore, and so it was a pretty wide open race. And also all city offices were up for election that year, all city council offices, and the borough presidents, district attorneys, etc. So it was a big electoral year in New York. And we noticed pretty quickly that there were a number of candidates for mayor that had already run for citywide office. So if you're like us and have been collecting and hoarding election data and voter registration information and geographic boundaries for many, many years, you could go back and look historically to see how people running in 2013, what their vote trends and vote patterns were in prior citywide elections, to maybe get a sense of what that might mean for their interest in running for mayor in 2013. So for example, and I'll show these, go into some more detail about these maps, but so William Thompson, who was running for mayor, he had run for mayor before in the prior election cycle. This is his general election results. Blue is where he won, red is where he lost, and he lost overall. Anthony Weiner also ran for mayor in 2005 in the two prior cycles. Green is where he won in the primary, and red is where he lost. He ended up not making it to the general election ballot. Phil de Blasio, who eventually became mayor, who's mayor now, also ran in 2009 for public advocate, and this is the Democratic primary results for him. And then John Liu ran for controller in 2009, and he was also a mayoral candidate in 2013. So, but in order to kind of neatly and consistently understand those prior voting patterns and what they might mean for 2013, and also how they might relate to demographic characteristics in the city, because through the great work of the Census Bureau, there's also very localized, either by block or block group or tract, demographic characteristics that you can also analyze. But the election district data is tricky when you're trying to compare it over time. And I'll go into more detail on this, but election districts change every year. There was an invitation to the Board of Elections to have someone speak here, so I don't have the expertise that they do in terms of actually managing the data internally, the data of record, and developing the election district boundaries in coordination with the New York City Planning Department. But I can at least speak from my experience of working with that information, that the boundaries are not drawn necessarily to match up with anything else. They're drawn for their particular purposes because they're designed to try to provide an efficient way of managing the poll sites and managing the election district results. And they have to meet certain criteria. Election districts are coterminous with assembly districts. And they're also, what was I going to say? Oh, and they're unique, they're numbered uniquely within assembly districts. So there's about 5,500 election districts in any given election in New York City, sometimes more, sometimes less, but they change, and sometimes they change year to year. That's the boundaries that change. The boundaries don't necessarily line up with anything else. Here's a sort of a quick map that shows, I forget what year election districts these are, but the election districts are in pink, and the tract, census tract boundaries are in blue. And you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap. And also, election districts don't necessarily even match local New York City administrative geography. So there are things that are called split block election districts, where they actually split a city block. And there are election districts, so this is Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village. And, you know, that's pretty wacky up there in terms of trying to match that geography with anything else. It matches sidewalks, I guess, I don't know. But, and also the buildings that are, you know, within each of those EDs. And the numbering also changes for election districts. So when they shift election districts year to year, they sometimes change the numbers. And more importantly, for redistricting, when the assembly district boundaries change, and sometimes the assembly district numbering changes pretty substantially. You know, this could be Assembly District 74, and then after redistricting, it becomes Assembly District 82. That means all the election districts in there change the numbers. So it's not that straightforward to compare election district results from 2001 to 2009. Nor is it straightforward to compare voting data by ED with any other geography that's out there and data that's provided by other geographies. So what we did was kind of think through what our methodology was going to be to do this. So we did an inventory of the data that was out there. So the Board of Elections is really the data holder of record for election information. They have voter registration information, which is the annual voter roll. You probably heard about that when there was this news for the April presidential primary, when the Board of Elections supposedly purged by accident about 120,000 voters from the voter roll. So they provide a list that you can request. It's public information as long as you're using it for research purposes or for election purposes. And it provides your name, your address, your date of birth, your gender, when you registered to vote, what party you registered to vote in, and when you voted. It doesn't say who you voted for, and it doesn't say if you voted in the party that you're registered in, but it does provide an indication of when you voted in runoffs, in primaries, and general elections. And that's by address, so you can geocode that information and then aggregate that up into other geographies. And then the election districts provide, the information is provided by ED for the number of people who voted in each election and the number of votes each candidate received. And then also other reference information that the city planning department provides and the Census Bureau. And so we created this methodology that I'll go through, and I'm sorry she's not here, but Kristen Grady, who was a PhD student at the time in geography from Lehman College, and is now working for the New York City Office of Emergency Management, she was the workhorse on this project. She not only provided a lot of really helpful insights and suggestions on the cartography, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also in, I don't want to say grunt work because graduate students get stuck with grunt work a lot, but she really helped think through the methodology and implement it, which was not easy, not straightforward. Basically what we did, we can go back to this slide, is we wanted to, number one, have a consistent geographic base, and also a base that preferably we'd be able to use to then match voting data with other information like demographics. So we decided, this shows census tracts, but we decided to use the more finer grained census block geography. There are about, from the 2010 census, there are about 30,000 inhabited census blocks in New York City with population. There's a whole bunch of them, like 9,000 more that have no population, either on land or in water. But 30,000. So we wanted to figure out how we can allocate election district data to census blocks. So we can then say in 2001, here's a map of the vote results for Mark Green and Mike Bloomberg by block. So we'd then be able to compare apples to apples across any time period, and then also compare that information, aggregate that up to tracts or pumas or some other census geography. So when you're overlaying geography that doesn't match, polygon geography that doesn't necessarily match up, there are a couple of ways that you can take the election district data and match it and add it to the blocks. You could use the area overlap, but in that case, there might be areas where there's no people in that particular block, but if that area takes up a substantial portion of the ED, you're going to allocate votes to that block that really shouldn't be there. You could also use population. You could say, based on the blocks that line up with these election districts, it's, the population percentage is this, and the population distribution indicates how we should allocate the ED data. But population isn't voters. There's about 4-point-something registered voters, 4-point-something million registered voters in New York City. For big turnout elections like presidential elections, there's about 2 million or so people voting. That's a fraction of the 8 or so million people of the city. So what we did was we decided to geocode active voters for each election, each primary and general election that we were interested in, to figure out, so this is people who voted in those elections that we know from the voter registration data that we've been requesting every year from the Board of Elections. We geocoded that to the street center line and then added that up for each piece of overlapping block and ED geography to come up with a total number of voters, so that's the base population by ED, and then by block, and then the proportion of active voters that the ED makes up of the block makes up of the ED, and then use that to then multiply the ED vote results for each of those pieces by those percentages, to then add up all the data by census block. It was, it's hard enough to explain, it was even harder to implement. And it was a really involved process. A lot of people vote, year to year, but not as many as you might think. And so we decided to independently geocode each primary and general election voter base. So we ended up geocoding about 18 million records over the span of, we actually went back to 2000 through, at the time, 2012, in order to do this process. And then, thank God for Kristen doing this work, and these are slides that she used for a presentation that she made to her advisors at Lehman College. She not only did the work to do the union and to create the methodology, And we had to do this dozens of times over because of all of the primary and general elections. And so she developed a Python script to do that. It was great. And she not only did it, but documented it. So if you're interested, I have a 8.5 by 11 version of a big poster that she put together that has really teeny tiny type. You can still make it out, but if you're interested, you can take a look at the methodology. And it was a multi-step process of joining, and we used ArcGIS for the desktop, and comparing numbers and multiplying and dividing, and again using Python to automate the process to some extent. It turns out, and I've talked to the GIS people at the city planning department about this, and they know about it. It's something that they should be more public about, but the bites of the Big Apple geography, the polygon geography, it has topological errors in it. And it's fine if you're just showing a map for a visual display of, census tracts or community boards or something. But when you're doing something more sophisticated, like unioning and determining the precise overlap of EDs that are from bites of the Big Apple with census blocks that we used a mix of from the bites of the Big Apple and from the census tiger data, you get errors. And it was confounding us for a while. We ended up having to use ArcGIS Desktop's repair geometry tool. First we used that to identify the problem, and then we used that to repair for each election district and for the block boundaries, we had to run that tool to fix these topological errors that the city planning department knows about but hasn't told anyone about. We had to find it by painful brute force. And then after that many-step process, we then created the atlas. And so we did a couple of interesting things with the atlas, and I'll show you the maps. Number one, we did this process of allocating election district data to census blocks to provide a much more finer-grained spatial pattern of the vote data and also compare that to demographic characteristics. We also used a cartographic technique that people in the industry call value by alpha maps. It's basically controlling the transparency of a choropleth color scheme to incorporate a new variable into the data. So a choropleth map, like the ones I showed, shows the color intensity corresponding to the underlying data. So you would say, all right, the percentage into the color intensity indicates the percent of the votes won by a given candidate. But we also wanted to give a sense of turnout. So in some areas, turnout is really high, and so that would indicate that that person won. Let's actually go back to Bill Thompson. That person won where these really dark blue areas are by a high percent, and turnout was really strong. In other areas where we used the turnout by, in this case by block, to control the transparency of the color. And in this case, we used a white background. You can also use a dark background and use kind of the opposite effect. So in central Brooklyn, he did well. He won that area, but turnout was pretty light, especially, and it was even worse in much of the Bronx. So you can it gave us another way of looking at the vote results. Most choropleth maps that wouldn't do that would just show all of these dark blue areas, and it wouldn't give that additional insight into the information, which we thought was really interesting, a new way of looking at the data. And I have a handout that kind of gives a bird's eye view of how we did some of these things, and we discuss it in much more detail as part of the atlas itself. And then we also partnered with the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and the CCEM, the Center for Community and Ethnic Media, to develop the atlas. They provided some funding support for it because the idea was we were really interested in this as academics and people interested in voting data. Certainly the politicians are, but they've got their own campaigns and consultants and pollsters. But the media used these maps extensively to kind of get some insight into what might happen for 2013 and to inform their report. So let me go to the atlas itself. In addition to the maps, we also created a series of demographic profiles by race and ethnicity. So you can look at characteristics citywide for, in this case, people with Irish ancestry, their age, their earnings, their income, and also by community area in terms of demographic characteristics, and also some voting statistics, again, to provide some context, mainly for reporters, but also for others interested in these issues. And then, again, dozens and dozens of maps. We also, so here's the general election 2009, where it shows the block level patterns for Bill Thompson versus Mayor Bloomberg, and we provide some basic analysis and some links to get the go directly to the Board of Elections website to get the results if you wanted. We also added, these are static maps, they're not really interactive, but we also provided a series of overlays, so you can kind of get a bird's eye view, a visual comparison of the vote results with neighborhood areas, race and ethnicity characteristics, and then transparency sliders, so you can see where the votes are in relation to where people are categorized by their predominant race and ethnicity characteristics. So that was a big effort. We think it was really helpful for a number of constituencies. We've built on it since. We've been, and we also did do some interactive maps. One thing we did was we mapped, this shows up, the primary turnout. We did something a little bit different here too. The color corresponds to this is by election district, which candidate won, and the intensity of the color, the choropleth scheme, corresponds to the turnout that they had for each candidate. So it's not the percentage that they won by, it's who turned out for who. And you can see some interesting things, like Bill Thompson, he was criticized for coming out against a Marine transfer station on the Upper East Side. And you can see this little oasis of red, which is where Thompson won, where he did really well. Yeah. Kind of an example of transactional voting. He was also very close with the Hasidic and Orthodox communities in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, South Brooklyn. John Liu did very well in Chinatown and Flushing. So these are interactive. You can also.
So what's going on up at the very top there? Is that Yonkers area?
No, it's just to the city, just to the Westchester line. This is Riverdale.
Oh, okay. There you go.
And then we have done some maps since then. We did a whole series of maps on the statewide election in 2014 for Governor Cuomo and Zephyr Teachout. And we also did a whole series of maps for the 11th Congressional District, where Michael Grimm won and lost, and then was imprisoned, and then Donovan ran. And
he's out now.
This was, yeah, right, he's out of prison. This was kind of interesting, actually, because you could see that people were saying, well, no, forget it, it's a Republican district, no Democrat can ever win. But Cuomo won the district in 2014. He won it in 2010. So, not, and I think actually Obama, he lost Staten Island, but I think he won the district, Congressional District 11 in 2012. So it's not unheard of that a Democrat can win. Ultimately, the Republican congressional candidate did win. And then a whole bunch of maps for the presidential primary. So you could see who voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, basically cops.
And you can see actually a bunch of places where, we live in a Democratic town, but there are a good amount of Republicans registered, but even where there are some Republicans, blank areas indicate where people just didn't vote in the Republican primary at all. And the only county that Trump lost was the county of New York, or of Manhattan, that John Kasich won. And these green areas in Brooklyn are where Ted Cruz did very well. Go figure. You know, we gave a whole bunch of presentations on this at the CUNY Journalism School before the 2013 election, before the primary actually. And the first question everyone would ask, well, all right, you have all this data from prior races, who's going to win? It's impossible to predict. All the polls that the cities do, that the papers do, the media outlets do, it's just crazy. The New York Times does this crazy thing where the day of the election, they have this online way of predicting who's going to win the night of. Just wait. Just a few hours. All this crazy effort to create these mathematical models that, you know, anything could happen.
Well, it becomes about television more than anything, I think.
So hopefully this gives you some insight into working with election data, with voter attribute information, with election district geography, and what's involved. We hope to be able to continue this and build on it. We'll see there's a big race coming up in 2017, also in, you know, a kind of repeat of 2013. So we'll see what happens then. We're also doing some other mapping. I won't talk too much about it because I know you're going to talk a lot about campaign contributions, but we're working with the New York City Campaign Finance Board to map campaign contributions from individuals to candidates in the 2017 municipal elections. So we'll see how that turns out. And that's it. Hope that was helpful.